from when we're recording here at 8 p.m. Thursday night. My name is David Young. I'm a member of Boot Brisbane, and with me this evening is Bill Bates, also a strong advocate for a new state of Central and North Queensland. And we're joined by a special guest, Jim Belshaw, who is one of the last people that was involved in the New England state movement all those years ago in northern New South Wales. And Jim is an experienced economist and historian, and as we discuss, he's going to take us through the struggle for self-government in northern New South Wales from its origins in the period before separation of the Moreton Bay colony in 1859 to the present time. And we're going to discuss certain things like their setbacks and struggles and what eventually has contributed to the benefits for northern New South Wales and beyond up until now. Jim has a long connection with the fight for New England, self-government and for country and regional development. His grandfather, David Drummond, was one of the founders of both the New South Wales Country Party and the Northern Separation Movement. His father, also Jim Belshaw, set up the Regional Councils movement at the end of the Second World War. He concluded that Sydney would never give real power to regional councils. Disillusioned, he turned to other ways of achieving decentralisation. The movement he created became the reborn New England's New State Movement. Jim became involved with the New England's New State Movement at a personal level when his grandfather asked him to act as an usher at the 1961 convention that launched Operation Seventh State. That's a great name. The campaign that led to the 1967 New South Wales plebiscite. At university, he helped set up the University of New England New State Society and became the society's representative on the movement's executive. Jim has an honours degree in history from the University of New England and has a master's in economics from the Australian National University. After completing his honours degree, Jim joined the Commonwealth Public Service as an administrative trainee before working in Treasury and the Commonwealth Industry Department as a professional economist. Jim then moved to the private sector, which was predominantly focused on in the high technology sector. After working as a consultant and manager of consulting practices and as a CEO of a specialist medical college, Jim chose to focus on writing and on his major history projects, including a history of northern New South Wales, which leads us to a very warm welcome, Jim.
Thank you very much.
And not only are you an avid history buff when it comes to all things regional New South Wales, you've got your historical links there through the family as well.
That's true. Some would say it makes me a little biased.
Oh.
Heaven forbid.
And we're not.
Well, gentlemen,
that's true.
I guess we should start with Jim. Your wealth of knowledge when it comes to economics, as well as your wealth when it comes to the history of predominantly, let's focus on northern New South Wales and the New England state movement. Where do you find the current state of things for New England and how you find yourself now focused on the fact that the current problems are the same as they ever have been, and they were essentially right to chase down their dreams and aspirations of creating a new state for New England?
I find that in writing the history, particularly in the second half of the 20th century and the first part of this century, many ways depressing. And I'll come back to some of that a little later, because New England has, and by New England I'm talking about the area including the Hunter Valley north to the Queensland border, has been in structural decline. As a consequence of that, we've lost political seats, we've lost influence. The attempts, we've also suffered from a major problem of the rise of localism and parochialism, because one of the things that the New State Movement did was it provided a unifying element. because what tended to happen is one town could be set against another town, what you call pottage politics. You give something here, you give something there, but nothing that will really address longer term problems. So I might talk a little bit more about that later. Perhaps, though, if we go back briefly into the 19th century.
Well, you go where you would like to go.
Because
we're avid listeners where we need to be.
Because the separation movement in northern New South Wales is directly connected with the separation of Queensland, and then later with the attempts inside Queensland to achieve self-government for individual areas. So Queensland, we go back to 1851. 1851, you had the separation of Victoria. Now, that was driven by the merchants of Melbourne, and also by an irascible Presbyterian clergyman who's a famous figure in Queensland history, John Dunmore Lang. Lang worked for and was successful in gaining the separation of what is now Victoria. He then turned his attention to Queensland, or the Moreton Bay colony. He was successful there too. He became the member of the New South Wales Parliament for Moreton Bay. Now, when Moreton Bay was being created, there was a debate about the southern boundary. Should the boundary be in where it is now? Should it be further south? When the first new state meeting was ever held in what is now northern New South Wales, Queensland, was held in Toowoomba, when the pastoral interests from the Clarence, the New England, the Western Plains, Darling Downs, gathered together to argue the cause for separation. Now, and at that stage, the northern districts stretched from the Hunter Valley to Cape York. Now, the interesting thing there, without going into too much detail, is that triggered a big debate across northern New South Wales, across the area I call New England, about whether to join Moreton Bay, whether to have their own state. When it became clear that the boundary line was going to go along where it is now, that's when it turned into the first movement for separation in northern New South Wales. And again, John Dunmore Lang, who had a vision of Australia as a republic with multiple states. John Dunmore Lang actually became the member for Clarence. So he'd been member for Melbourne, he'd been member for Moreton Bay, he's now member for Clarence, and is campaigning to create a separate colony in northern New South Wales.
So basically he was the ultimate agitator.
He was indeed. And he's a very important figure in the history of Queensland, although he would not be happy at what the results were, because he saw it as a process, not as something that would forever be fixed in, the boundaries ever fixed in stone.
And we remembered him justly by, I just remembered, gentlemen, that it was Lang Park is now Suncorp Stadium. It was named after him. I just remembered that.
There you go. Now, one of the things that happened in the fight for those who were for and anti-self-government or creation of northern New South Wales as a colony, those who were anti were able to use certain, essentially, they went to the political system in Sydney and said, you've got to give these people something. And they said, look, you're going to be better off. Here we're getting things for you. You're better off staying where you are. That first movement died down, but then it appeared again in no less than 7 times between then and Federation, mainly centred in this initial period in the Clarence Valley. And one of the challenges, this illustrates a challenge, because the competing towns of Lismore and Grafton, at this stage, if Grafton was arguing for something, and it was seen that it might benefit, it might lead to a railway across the mountains, Lismore wanted that railway, and as a consequence of that, it was very easy for the factional system of New South Wales politics to play one area against the other. Now, today, Sydney has 73%, I guess, of the state population, but the percentage share, with the expansion in European settlement, Sydney's share of the state population was only 28%. So more people, for every person living in Sydney effectively, there were 2 living outside Sydney. And then from the 1880s, late 1870s, that's when the drift to the city began. So now you already see, just in this colonial period, and it wasn't as sustained, the agitation wasn't as sustained as it was in Queensland, you can already see some of the features that would occur and reoccur later on. The centralisation of authority or power in the capital city, a political system based upon a total state whereby people were able to play one area against another area for short-term political gain, promises of development, but promises that weren't delivered. So by Federation, Northern New South Wales, the idea of self-government as a way of redressing evils associated with the then existing system was well established. With Federation, at the time of Federation, nobody thought that the state boundaries were fixed forever. Particularly, there was the expectation that in Queensland, the attempts to bring self-government for Central Queensland and North Queensland, I think we were talking earlier, and you referred to the 1890, was it, petition?
1890, correct, yes.
1890, yes.
Well, so the expectation was that Queensland would be subdivided and that other states would be created. And that's why there's the clauses in the Constitution, or the wording of those clauses has created significant problems, as you well know. Now we come to the early part of the 20th century, and we go into the first mass wave of support for, really broad-based support for self-government for Northern New South Wales. In 1915, it began in 1915 with a Grafton doctor, Earl Page. He was mayor of South Grafton. The steam ferry had been, that was used, the Helen, which was used to cross the Clarence, was cancelled by the Sydney government. A protest meeting was convened, and that turned into a new state meeting. Page formed a development league and started arguing that the only way to achieve development in northern New South Wales was through self-government. And that exploded. We were in the middle of the war. That exploded. It spread like wildfire along the coast with support coming up onto the tablelands. Page went off to the war. Agitation died down, but as soon as he got back from the war, he relaunched the movement. And so we had again with the two themes, one was development leagues, and the second one was the idea that northern New South Wales had to have its own autonomy if it was to achieve the vision that Page had for its development. And Earl Page, of course, would later become leader of the Federal Country Party, Deputy Prime Minister in the Bruce Page government, and a very, very long-serving parliamentarian. In his own way, he was also a stormy petrel. And now Page had pushed that movement along, but it coincided with another movement in northern New South Wales, which was the creation or moves to create a country party. And that combined people who felt that the area was not being developed with the problems that were experienced by farmers, especially small farmers, who were facing increasingly international competition. That culminated, so as I said, you had the emergence of the Country Party. Now, the young people in New South Wales, the Country Party at state level was initially called the Progressive Party. And that was an amalgam of some of the older style politicians with the new young country members, none of whom had any political experience. In the 1920 elections, the Progressive Party in northern New South Wales almost swept the board. Not quite, but it almost swept the board. And all of the members of the party in northern New South Wales were committed to self-government. And that commitment to self-government also brought in town interests behind the party. So now we have a new political movement, the Progressive Party. We have quite strong support for self-government. And then we have a newspaper editor called Victor Thompson. Thompson was the editor of the Tamworth Observer, a committed newssater. He persuaded his board to launch a newspaper campaign for self-government for northern New South Wales. That began, and then he organised newspapers across northern New South Wales to support the campaign. They formed what was called a Press Propaganda League. And the Press Propaganda League had, I think at its peak, 130 newspapers. They weren't all members of the league, but 130 newspapers from the Upper Hunter to the Queensland border. And that campaign took off. It really, really took off. And out of that came the first formally structured Northern New State movement or Northern separation movement. Now, again, if you look at the history here, what is happening is the importance of the newspapers, of the media, as a vehicle for the promotion of local and regional development, political objectives, and the difficulties that can arise, say as happened later in New South Wales, if the local media loses their independence, and that becomes an impediment. But what Thompson also did through the Press Propaganda League was he was creating a set of common views across newspapers, the idea of the North, as you have in Queensland. The idea of the North, and that tempered local parochialism, that allowed for cooperation between areas instead of towns competing for one thing against another. There was now scope for cooperation, and this would be very critical later in the 20s with the establishment of the Armidale Teachers College in 1928, and then later still with the New England University College in 1938. In Parliament, the Progressive Party was in a degree of chaos. You had a group in the Progressive Party who wanted to go into coalition with the Nationalists, which is then equivalent of the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party has changed its name a number of times. Go in coalition with the Nationalists. You had the leader of the Libs, or the Nationalists, who was certainly not interested in new states, and new states were Progressive Party policy, and the party split. The coalitionists went into an arrangement with the Nationals, and what were called the True Blues in country party hagiography, the people like Drummond, Brooksner, Vincent, they held out, and they would become the country party. Now, they were that group. It was very easy. It was easier for them to support self-government than it was for the others. We have a problem, first of all, with the Labor Party. In the period straight after the First World War, the Labor Party adopted a unificationist platform. It lasted until the 1970s. Now, a lot of people in the Labor Party, including John Curtin and Frank Ford, did support, were cautious about the centralisation of power in Canberra. They recognised that certain things that the Labor Party wanted to do might require constitutional change to bring greater power to the Commonwealth. They were concerned, though, that it would just be creating another dominant centre. You now have two competing sets of ideas. You've got one set of ideas saying what Australia needs are provincial councils, and a lot more of them, and a second set of ideas saying what Australia needs are new states, by which were meant sovereign states who could not, unlike local government, simply be abolished or altered by central fiat. Down in Sydney, the tensions are becoming greater, and ultimately what happens is the Labor government falls, then Labor government falls, the Nationalists go into power with the support of some of the coalitionists. The Country Party is sitting on the crossbench, or still the Progressive Party, sitting on the crossbench. And then there are a series of events which come very close to bringing the fuller government down, the nationalist government down. And one price of the Progressive Party support, not form a coalition at this stage, but support for the fuller government, was a Royal Commission into new states, the Cohen Commission.
This guy that's talking is like a historian. So
prior to that, we've had buck shifting that would be familiar to you,
really cool
where each time you said new states, they said, oh, that's a matter for the Commonwealth.
They called members True Blue.
And when you go to the Commonwealth, they say that's a matter for the states. There's been a lot of pressure, because Page is now Deputy Prime Minister. There's been quite a lot of pressure on the federal government to take action to intervene. But it kept on coming back to the starting point that at the end of the day, you have to go, if you don't have the support of the state government, or at least the tacit compliance of the state government, you're in trouble. So they've got their new States Royal Commission, the Cohen Commission. Now, Drummond, who moved the motion setting in the Parliament that led to the commission being set up, learnt a rather salutary lesson, one which he would take into account later on. The Premier had there was no way he was going to agree to anything serious being done. The Cohen Commission terms of reference were carefully crafted so that the new staters had to go through, the Commission had to go through and make judgments on a series of hoops, so which included things like desirability, necessity, alternative ways of achieving the same thing. The Commissioner was himself a long-serving nationalist party supporter. The council assisting the Commission, William Holman, had had his political career destroyed by the Progressive Party. And the members of the committee, even though the Commission, even though it included two new staters, was structured in such a way as to achieve a guaranteed negative result. Nevertheless, they had the Commission, and the movement organised itself, and it was a very big effort because you got people, Commission hearings, the submissions, and this is being done without any form of political or any form of staff support. There are also some funny scenes because at some of the Commission hearings you had Page drawing from Commonwealth Treasury figures because he's the Treasurer, and you've got the idea of Commonwealth Treasury officials providing information to oppose State Treasury officials. So it was quite an interesting thing. Now, out of that, the Commission concluded that new states were neither necessary nor desirable. It concluded that there were justifiable country grievances, but that those grievances were being met and that the appropriate solution was the creation of provincial or county councils, big ones, within New South Wales to provide a degree of local autonomy. Now, when we're talking about some of the debates now, when I'm talking about with some people, they say, oh, look, now what we need are provincial councils or county councils, decentralisation of administration. Say, look, this is a very old argument. This was articulated in the 1920s. It first emerged in the 1880s, and so far it just hasn't worked. Now, another feature of this early period, and I'm going to jump forward a bit now, was the attempt to create a national new state organisation, which included representatives from North Queensland, among others, North Queensland, Capricornia, New England, Riverina, Monero, Gippsland, the Goldfields. There were one or two other smaller ones as well. And the idea was, or the people, movement leaders believed, that some form of national coordination would assist their political cause. So one of the things that came from that later on there was cooperation between the various new state movements. The Cohen Commission report was not as damaging as it might first seem, because a thing called the multiplier had not then been invented by Lord Keynes. So they concluded, apart from some sus calculations in regard to state services, they concluded that, or did fail to recognise, that if you transfer so much money out of Sydney into northern New South Wales, and they just looked at the costs of the transfer, they didn't fail to realise that with a 2 or 3 times multiplier, the economic gains for northern New South Wales, there would be cost for Sydney, but the economic gains for northern New South Wales would far outweigh the accounting costs based on comparative statics. The movement was exhausted and collapsed. Well, not totally collapsed, but it went into recess. But the political leaders then started, or the leadership of the movement, including the political leadership, then started looking at what was called the functional approach to new states. And that is creating the infrastructure that is necessary to support a new northern state. And they're also now cooperating. So out of that came things like wool selling at Newcastle, which was forced through against the opposition of all of the wool breaking firms. It helped with the New England National Park with Dorrigo. It helped with the creation of Armidale Teachers College and the New England University College. And the New England University College was specifically intended to be the University of the North. I should pause here. We'll make this, because I'm probably going into far too much detail for you.
It's all very interesting.
It's
all very interesting, and it's all, you know. I couldn't help but think, but just before, it was about 15 minutes ago when you were leading up into the earlier part of the 20th century, that you started using terms of people from 1880 onwards that they were forming development leagues, and they were wanting more autonomy, and they were sick of the promised politics and the not being adequately developed, and then you lead on to the whole. Then you led on to Lord Keynes, I believe you said, of the multiplier effect, where more bang for buck is created when the investment is taken away from more centralised and populated areas and invested in the regions. It's just economic. It's more economically viable to have more return for the general populace at large, and better for that community. And it can't help that it defies belief that we are here in a place like central and North Queensland, and still no doubt from where you are in northern New South Wales, that this was 130 and 40 years ago.
Yes. One of the reasons why I say history is important, even if I perhaps provide too much detail, is because a lot of the things aren't new, and a lot of the things, the arguments have a habit of being repeated. I've been through every no argument. I'll get onto a couple of the yes ones later on. I've been through every no argument, and there's a pattern of, and the Cohen Commission said, we're going to have regional councils, county councils. That never happened. The Cohen Commission said, accepted that the country had been disadvantaged, but that was being addressed. Well, it really wasn't addressed in any coherent way. Now, another lesson from this period, which will be repeated later on, is the ability, or one of the gains from separatist agitation, is that it forces people to actually take into account needs and grievances in areas. And a second of the gains is that it articulates new ideas and provides a base for new types of economic and social action. But I'll pick speed up. We now come through, we hit the Depression, and all of a sudden, new state agitation surges. The movement's relaunched again by Page at a speech in Glenray in 31. And the branch structure and the membership literally explodes across northern New South Wales. And a parallel movement in the Riverina, led by Charles Hardy, also emerges. Now, there's a whole lot of interesting history in here, but the bottom line, just from the viewpoint of our present conversation, is that the Country Party was able this time to force another Royal Commission, the Nicholas Commission. That commission terms of reference drafted by Drummond. Drummond's the constitution writer for the New England New State Movement, drafted by Drummond. This time were very, very carefully drafted to get a positive result. So there wasn't a question of were new states a good thing or a bad thing? The specific requirement was to draw up boundaries. It was a boundaries commission to draw up boundaries for areas in New South Wales suitable for self-government as states. And this guaranteed that there'd be at least some positive result out of it, and indeed Nicholas concluded that 3 areas of New South Wales, or New South Wales should be broken up into, or could be broken up into 3 states, and recommended plebiscites, referendums be held. Now, again, we have a situation where the movement is becoming absolutely exhausted. It had been a huge effort. The Depression has eased. Agitation has died down. Now, the movement did something during this expansion that would come back to haunt it. The Country Party leadership, all new staters, have a problem because you've now got a whole series of new political movements coming through. So they actually combine the Country Party and the new state movements to form the United Country movement, which is initially very, very successful. That gets lots of people into Parliament, but it types the New State movement as being not just having a lot of the same people as the Country Party, but it does type the New State movement and the Country Party as being the same thing. And it guarantees, it increases the animosity to the self-government cause among the Labor supporters and also the Nationalists. During the war,
so basically, sort of, what we've tried to do as Boot Brisbane is stay apolitical, so we can at least approach all political parties. But what we find with that is, well, the Labor Party has no interest, and same with the Liberals, because they still want to keep holding power in southeast Queensland. So we're stuck with just talking to the miners. But the other problem we've got is, although it's good to be apolitical to have that dialogue, we also know that only political party is actually going to make the government of the day initiate the process. A public group is not going to initiate the process. It has to be done in sort of a similar way, where a small party has a bounce of power and it's committed to a new state and gets the vote, gets the bounce of power and negotiates with the major party to initiate the process. And I think that's one of the real difficult things now.
Yes. One of the challenges, it can be a difficult, in a practical political sense, it can be a difficult balancing act. Because you can be damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Well, when it comes to the sovereignty of the regions of Central and North Queensland, it's like it was of country New South Wales, Northern New South Wales. It comes to the point when push comes to shove that the political means is the only avenue to take it, and people were ultimately forced to take it into the historical context.
That's true. I'm trying to think of how to respond to that in the most sensible way. At the end of the day, what happens with political parties is that they create divides which can make cooperation across groups difficult. So you need to create, and this is what we were doing in the 60s, you need to create political pressures, not by supporting people who support you, but not by supporting particular political parties. It's a question of gaining popular support. That has always been the crux of it. How do you gain the popular support, and how do you sustain the popular support? Because we've already seen with the New England movement in the 1920s and 1930s how you get a rise and fall of popular support, but also how difficult it is for voluntary organisations with limited resources to sustain the political pressures.
Just quickly, I'd like to welcome another person to the live guests, and Raj, would you like to say hello?
Hi Jim, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. Raj, yourself?
Yeah, I'm finally in Northern New South Wales, so there you go. Originally in Amsterdam.
Where are you phoning from?
Pottsville.
From?
Pottsville, next to Kingscliff, Pottsville.
Oh, yes, I know.
Raj is originally from Cairns, Jim, and he's just recently moved down there, and He's a very strong advocate for a new state of North Queensland also.
Oh, well, I'm glad
why I'm calling, listening to Jim and all the history, it's really fascinating to listen to it. It's great. And I think hopefully this podcast then we can share and other people can listen. But one issue I think is never discussed and is that the state of the issue, and what a lot of Australians forget is that the most powerful body in Australia is the Senate. And when you talk about the politics of statehood, does it not come down to, the parties looking that if they create a new state, how the balance in the Senate is going to change? Depending on how many votes. I mean, you take an example now where I think, Tasmania, you have, the senator from Tasmania, Jackie Lambie. Yeah. You look out of South Australia, you have the central, what do you call them? There's the two senators, I've forgotten the Centre Party.
Central Alliance.
Exactly, Central Alliance. Sorry, I'm my body a bit. But what I'm getting at is, so in the north, we have nothing to balance that. They have, control in the Senate, and a lot of legislation is controlled by them. I mean, only today, if you've noticed, they're going to bring in a corruption bill, right? They're forcing a corruption bill. And
yes.
Would you believe, I mean, very interestingly, Bob Catter, our northern politician who is joining the Greens and to vote for it, which I found very interesting because every other thing he talks about is anti-green, but now he's voting with them. So anyway, so my question really is, does it not revolve? And I've looked at other federations, even in America. I read somewhere, even there they have a huge issue about creating new states because there the Republican Party on average controls the Senate. Right,
yes.
On most years, and so they will always vote against it because they don't want to lose the balance.
This is this. I'm sorry, I was getting an echo chain.
Just turn your microphone off, please, Raj.
Okay.
Sorry. Away you go, Jim.
It is correct. One of the problems that we have, where you have strong political parties, it creates a difficulty in achieving things which totally depend upon cross-party support. And there's not an easy answer to that. But I think two things. One, that I'm getting some music.
Raj, is that you and the Indian fellows?
Raj, you there?
Yeah. Sorry, my whole system's going crazy. Yeah. Sorry about that.
That's all right. This is jumping forward a little, but essentially it's a question of keeping pressure on political leaders, and that has to be done really in keeping pressure at local level. So it's a campaign, there's a constant campaigning issue. Now, people don't, thinking how to phrase this, there are question marks, concerns about what might happen in the Senate if in fact you've got more states, because then it becomes more difficult for party machines to control. The Senate becomes more diverse. So I don't have I'm probably rambling a little bit. I don't have a clear answer to the question that you're raising. I was thinking of Mr. Katter, because it seems to me that Mr. Katter, although he is someone who is committed to North Queensland separation, he does seem to be fairly variable in his commitment. Is that a fair assessment?
Very fair assessment. Well, yes and no, but it's not unjustified.
I think he's well versed in speaking that it supports the North Queensland state, but when it comes down to actual active advocacy for it, there is absolutely zero effort on his part or the KAP's part to deliver a separate state. They just ingratiate themselves to the people of North Queensland by mentioning it occasionally in the odd interview or media contact, but they have never actually actively advocated for it, or initiated any sort of meetings or posted things on Facebook to encourage people to look at separate state. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah, I wondered about that.
And that's what we're finding more and more. I've found that the more we get the message out about how we can actively take the path to trying to at least use certain political means like a hung parliament, and having those representatives from the areas of central and north Queensland force the issue, that we need those people to actually be on board more than just paying the campaign lip service. So that's what we found, if I might make that summary.
Yeah, I'm going to just go on with the history a little bit more, but in a moment, just so that I'm rounding it off. But one of the things, if you look at the history of the New England movement, the movement has achieved things at a time when the political system becomes more fluid. It's achieved things, and there are particular times when you can achieve things. So, for example, even though the Cohen Commission was not a success from the movement's viewpoint, they were able to get a Royal Commission. With the Nicholas Royal Commission, again, the political stars aligned so that they were able to get a Royal Commission, and then that gave them at least gave them formal recognition of boundaries. But one of the things that's interesting there, just going on a bit, is that from the experience of the New England movement, you have to be able to do a couple of things. You have to be able to sustain agitation over extended periods, and you have to position yourself to be able to move when the circumstances are right, so you can take advantage. This may be adopting a longer term viewpoint from your view, but let me just go briefly on to the next period. So the agitation of the 30s comes to an end. We come into the war. Post-war reconstruction, there are all sorts of new ideas coming through. My father, Jim Belshaw Sr., comes up with the idea of regional councils, and we've already seen discussion about regional councils, as a mechanism. And he starts campaigning across, visiting, writing to councils, visiting newspapers, conducting public meetings to set up a regional councils movement. And then that leads in 1948 to a big conference in Armidale on decentralisation. And what happens is that by then, the regions as defined are too small. There are no powers being given to the regions that would allow them to do anything. And that turns into a reborn New England New State movement. And this time the movement does two things that are different. First of all, it goes back to being non-party political. Of course, if you're agitating for separation, that's political. But it goes back to non-party political to try to reduce the pressures, or to at least mute. Yeah, that's right. But the second thing is, it employs staff. Now, it doesn't have a lot of money, but it still has a solid parliamentary base of support, and it's got enough people who are prepared to put up cash to fund at least part-time staff. And that means that from that point, the movement is no longer dependent upon and runs. The Labor Party is in power in New South Wales, which is not going to have a bar of it. We come up to 1961, and the movement has a convention in Armidale to extend Operation Seventh State. And this time they're looking for a large, the biggest kitty that they can get. So they raise 100,000. One of these people get promising to give certain sums of money over a 5-year period. So they get £100,000 committed. And from that point, and now we've got a strong campaign office in Armidale. They bring in Executive Director Gary Neal on to support Ulrich Ellis as the campaign director. And now we've got printing presses and duplicating machines, really, although we've got access to printing presses. And that then launches a really big-scale sustained campaign. So we're able to do things like mount car drives on Sydney. The branch structure is being developed, and this is when I start to become involved. Now, in 63, I'm trying to remember my election dates. They've already got a commitment out of both the Liberal and country parties for a referendum, for a plebiscite. Then that is reaffirmed when the Askin government comes into power. That is reaffirmed.
That's 1965.
65, yes. Yep. So it had been reconfirmed at the 63 election, it's reconfirmed at the 65 election. Now, the boundaries recommended by Nicholas, which the movement had in fact adopted, included Newcastle. And the reasons for that were that the railhead was at Maitland for the northern and the coastal lines. You couldn't logically put a boundary through the middle of the Hunter Valley, but they wanted the railheads, and they also thought that there'd be benefits, economic benefits, in having a more diverse economic base. Now one can argue about that, but that had been adopted. A lot of people think that Askin rigged the boundaries. I think one of the reasons why Askin, he didn't, but one of the reasons why Askin was prepared to agree to it is that he probably thought it was going to be very difficult for the movement to win. Now, the movement had been working in Newcastle quite significantly. With the announcement of the Purdue, who for a long period was the independent mayor of Newcastle, was a strong new status. So I've been lobbying the council and trying to build up support. Once the announcement of the plebiscite was made, the movement opened an office in Newcastle with a campaign director in Newcastle. So we've got the office in Armidale, campaign director in Armidale. We've also got organisers. It really was a full-scale, well-resourced campaign. We went down by 30,000 votes. Outside in the north, our yes vote was up to 72%, but we performed badly in two areas. The first one were the milk board electorates, which were supplying milk to Sydney. During the campaign, the Premier indicated that they would lose access to the Sydney milk market, which he couldn't actually do because it would be interference of cross-border trade. But it created a lot of consternation, and our yes vote in the milk electorates was dropped to 35%. We've got, running in political terms, the Country Party is not formally campaigning. Labor is formally campaigning against. The Libs, there are some Lib supporters, but far more opponents. In the urban coalfields electorates, our yes vote dropped, I think from memory, to something like 28%. So that offset the yes vote, the very, very high yes vote elsewhere. A problem. Askin considered that he considered he'd delivered on his commitment. So then there was the question of how would the movement respond? The Country Party people, while we still had strong support, the Country Party people, or parliamentarians, were counselling patience, take your time. It's quite clear that the support had diminished in the Parliamentary Party, and that's when the movement made the decision. It did two things. It decided to redraw the boundaries to get rid of the no areas. The Askin refused point blank to have another Boundaries Commission, and so they went. So there was a problem there, and then they decided to run new state candidates, and that was effectively running candidates against the Country Party, and all hell broke loose. The base new state vote, in other words, the new state vote, where people would vote new state independent of political issues, was lower than the movement realised. People resigned from the Country Party. People resigned from the New State movement, and it became very, very personal. And essentially at that point, exhausted, the movement collapsed.
Yes, it's very disappointing, and it sounds like Askin got the result he always wanted, in my opinion, and had the ability to just outright refuse everybody that was involved in the movement progressing any further. And I guess that is the times that we live in here in central and North Queensland, where the political games only ever to their own ends either hinder or help in whatever way helps the agenda best for whoever's speaking on the subject. And Lord knows, Bill would know, having to deal with most of the people who are politically involved in central and North Queensland, that sure, they might be inclined to possibly speak or be involved when it might serve their agenda better, but lip service doesn't pay anyone in central North Queensland any service.
Yeah. The movement is starting to come back in that support has been growing again. When I started advocating, one of the things I found was that people had forgotten their history. You know, the automatic assumptions about people, about events, about cooperation, that had diminished. People simply didn't know. And as a consequence of that, it was hitting them with something new, a concept, not the concept that had been around and argued through, but a concept that was actually new to them. And one of the, thinking how to describe this, essentially we'd lost our history. And we'd also lost a fair bit of our culture. We'd lost the media structures that had supported the campaign in the past. So it becomes an education and a rebuild. There were 3 to 4 attempts from the 90s to start agitation, which had some impact. When interest really began to grow again, and it's a slow process, when interest really began to grow again,
we're going to wrap up.
It came from the Lower Hunter. It actually came from Newcastle. And the trigger, or the biggest trigger, were the way in which 1.3 million of coal royalties was not benefiting coal mining areas. And for the first time, the Herald and the Newcastle media started carrying New State material. But it's been a slow process. But now, can I pull some of this together by just giving you some take-home messages?
Yes, please do. And we should probably start wrapping up, because it's been roughly an hour, and I'm sure all of us are dreaming of pillows, soft pillows, and comfortable beds. But go on, Jim.
Okay. First of all, people don't understand the practical impediments in an administrative and policy sense to the that can affect or adversely affect country areas. And it's not necessarily sins of commission, but sins of omission. For example, the concentration of government services for efficiency reasons in particular localities. They need to have that, my feeling is they need to have that explained to them. The second thing is that while the movement campaigned, in a sense, much the same type of arguments that you're using, it's important to have positive elements in the campaign. It's important to get people talking about issues. But the third thing is, and this is a difficult one, or a particularly difficult one, it's very difficult to straddle. The New England New State Movement Facebook group has people who range from the far left to the far right. So we've got Greens, for example. And you have to find a way, in your messaging, find a way of unifying or combining. Perhaps the most important thing, as is something, is that when I look at what's been achieved in Northern New South Wales, for all the failures, the New State Movement has been the biggest single source of gain for the region or for the area. And this has been very parochial and selfish. The squeaky wheel gets the oil, so that regardless of whether one wins or loses in some of these things, and it provides immediate gains. Universities, teachers' colleges. So in campaigning on the grievance side, and in trying to articulate on the positive side, it really is worthwhile just keeping on going. And I guess the last headline is it really does help to have staff. I shall pause there.
Yeah, well, we haven't got that, but we have some pretty keen people. And I think one of the major differences now is in the time when New England was going hell for leather, the Queensland movement was basically dead because we had the gerrymander. And we had a situation where we had about 40 or more seats in regional areas compared to the southeast corner. And you've got to remember that the population explosion for the Brisbane, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast never happened till the 80s. And so regional Queensland was still fairly well populated compared to the southeast corner. So we did have a lot of representation in the regional areas. However, that's changed. We have a situation now since the end of the gerrymander. In the election, I think it was the 1986 election, Central and North Queensland had 24 seats in an 89-seat parliament.
Yeah.
Today, that equates to 27% of the representation. Today, we have 17 seats in a 93-seat parliament. So now we have 17% representation in the parliament. It's forecast that come the next redistribution, there will be another 560,000 voters added to the list, added to the voting roll, that will require a complete redraw of boundaries and reallocation of quotas and things like that. And we can expect the Brisbane Parliament to increase to about 98 seats. And guess what? We'll be lucky if we hold on to the 17 seats, because our population is not increasing in step with the southeast corner. They are actually increasing at twice the rate of population growth we have. So naturally, in the one man, one vote system, they're going to get more seats down there, and we're going to be lucky to hold on to the 17 seats we've got. And the reason I got involved with the movement, I mean, a lot of people carry on about our fair share and money and all this. To me, it's never been about that. I got involved in 2017 after the redistribution, and they added an extra 4 seats to the southeast Queensland. And that should have been a big event in regards to the conversation of going forward, that our influence in the Brisbane Parliament is diminishing. And I don't really know what it's going to take for people or leadership in Central North Queensland to wake up and say, well, when do you start fighting for proper representation, or are you just going to let yourself become, say, 15 seats in a 105-seat parliament, or then keep going on for another 20 years and you become, 10 seats in a 130-seat parliament? So to me, it's about representation, not about fair share. And the thing that sort of gets me is, here we are, we've got 1 million people in Central North Queensland. We have potentially the greatest powerhouse of the nation in regards to resources and potential, if we get the funding, if we get the momentum to develop. But that's not going to happen without political representation. You've got a situation where Tasmania, 520,000 people. It's got its own parliament with a lower house of 25 members, upper house of 15 members, 5 federal members of the House of Representatives, and 12 senators, all batting for their interests. What have we got batting for us? Next to nothing, because regardless what people say, we might have we've got 3 senators choosing to live in regional Queensland, but ultimately they are just members of a Brisbane political headquarter party. So they're answerable to the headquarters in Brisbane, although they pay us lip service, but overall they just go along whatever the party line is set by Brisbane. And until we wake up and start fighting for political representation that can take us forward, I think that's the problem.
Part of what you just said, Bill, reminded me of something what our friend Henry Fruckier says down in Townsville, is that the new state is not about retaining opportunity from southeast Queensland. We're not out to take anything away from them, but rather we're all for growing the opportunity that would otherwise not exist in Central and North Queensland. It's only better for us. It's only better for our local economies. It's only better for our local communities. It's better for what would be the new existing state, and it would be better for the Federation and the nation. And it would be no different if New England was to return onto the same tact as we are up here in Central North Queensland and fight for that. It's nothing but the right thing for everybody.
Jim, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Jim, the one party that's interested me in the whole debate is the National Party, and I just wanted to ask you, people like Barnaby Joyce have written articles about creating a new state. He's a big supporter. Matt Canavan, who used to work for Barnaby Joyce, is a senator who brought this subject up 2 years ago. So my question really is, what is the influence in northern New South Wales with the National Party? Because since they merged with the Liberals in Queensland, they call themselves National Party, but they're not National Party. They stand as LNP. Yep. They're big supporters. Do you have the same influence with the National Party here, or do you think the National Party's influence is going to, be lowered with the Shooting and Fishers Party, etc.?
We were talking earlier about shifts in distribution of seats and also reduction in the number of seats. Within the broader New England, the Liberal Party base is small. There is a Green group which is concentrated in the Northern Rivers. It's the indirect, but I will come back to your precise question. The Labor Party is actually articulating some of the grievances, but their seats are particularly in the lower Hunter. The National Party came very close to being wiped out by the country independents. So a huge swathe from the coast right across through central New England was held by independents. That independent tide has receded, and the Nationals have returned to more or less, this is traditional national heartland, Northern New South Wales, traditional country party heartland. The support by the party for new states, or by, can best be, it's lukewarm. And that is one of the issues why in some of the talking I'm doing, I'm playing down, we're talking about the need for cross-party support. So Barnaby Joyce has certainly talked about more states, a New England state, and I think that's genuine. But it's not. We don't at the moment have. We're not as far advanced as you are at the present in terms of campaign structures. We don't have the strength to force. Well, we get individual wins, but we don't have the strength yet to force parties to take us seriously. So pulling that together, I think that the National Party is potentially, there's still support there. Among National Party members, particularly inland, there's definitely support there. I mean party members. But we've got some way to go before we turn that back into an effective political tool. But I don't think it's impossible.
But with
reason I bring it up.
With New South Wales, isn't it now really that the National Party is so aligned with the Sydney Liberals that a lot of people in the country perceive them as sort of pseudo-liberals anyway, and that's why the Fishers and Party and other people are sort of taking to stick to them in some electorates, especially over issues like when New South Wales Liberals pushed because of a TV show on the ABC, the government of the day, I think it was a Baird government, went crazy. Oh, we're going to get rid of the dogs sort of thing because of the cruelty. And then the National Party supported the Liberals in that stance and really upset a lot of people in regional New South Wales. And then they did the same thing again when they tried to, made a directive of amalgamating councils. So thought the National Party would have been sort of trying to calm the Liberals down, not to be so aggressive on the country party issues, but they didn't seem to stick up for their traditional or grassroots supporters.
There is in New South Wales, inside the National Party, there is a very strong view that the party, and indeed the party has been doing this, that the party has been too subservient to the Liberal Party. If you look at what John Barilaro has said, the Deputy Premier, leader of the National Party, he is very much pushing an independent line. Adam Marshall, who is the Minister for Ag and our local member, while he is a good, he works within the coalition, he is quite prepared. He is quite prepared to take a country line. So, for example, in New South Wales, when the Northern Tablelands wasn't getting COVID-19 information, and the Hunter New England Health people said it was inappropriate to provide that, and we were showing stats which has high, relatively high COVID numbers in the district as a whole, but that's all down in Newcastle, Lake Macquarie. And now in that case, Marshall intervened and forced the supply of information. So that's actually going back to a question that Raj asked. I think that I haven't discussed separation with with Adam. I've only come back into Armidale, in fact, 6 months ago. So I've been working from outside. My feeling is that he certainly knows my views, I should add. We've had email exchanges. My view is that there is scope for people like Adam, if we can articulate it properly. I'm a little bit less certain of that on the coast. You were talking about demographic change in Queensland. In the 1980s, from 72 through to 1990, the coast added something like 800,000 people. Whereas inland New England had been roughly in balance with the coast. Suddenly, the coast is in demographic terms dominating, and that huge influx of people during a time when the movement wasn't campaigning and wasn't keeping the message alive. You've got you've got hundreds of thousands of people who have no historical memory at all and who don't identify with the North, who may identify with a particular region or particular locality. And there's a rebuild required there. The significance of that for the Nationals is that the coastal Nationals are under a different set of pressures and priorities. Now, some of the poorest electorates in Australia, poorest areas in Australia are now on the North Coast. And I don't think that at the moment the coastal members of Parliament are articulating or really know how to deal with that. On the other hand, I wouldn't give up hope in them because there have been huge changes in political mixes in the last 2 to 3 years. So, going back to bringing that together to Raj's point, I think there is scope with the National Party. With the shooters and fishers, I know a lot of the shooters and fishers Northern membership is pro-New State. Quite a few of them are members of the Facebook group. Labor is more of a problem because, particularly down on the coast, you've got Labor people who remember, who's still fixated on self-government as being a country party plot. But Labor down in the Hunter, where there is a lot of there are a lot of pressures around in Hunter. For example, Fitzgibbon almost lost his seat this last election, or he did almost lose his seat. He had a huge to One Nation. That was a huge swing, and he's come out swinging about the need to recognise certain interests. It's fluid. I suppose I'd pull this together. It's fluid, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to. Work out. But I do think we were up on, we're past your, I don't have my watch in front of me, but we're past your podcast time.
Yes, Jim, we've just been taken away by your great wealth of knowledge and expertise when it comes to the New England state movement and all these little nooks and crannies of the story that even myself I was delighted to hear, and thank you very much for sharing it. But you are right, it's 9:30 now, so does anyone have any finishing remarks they'd like to make before we close up?
Just that I'd like to invite Jim to come back at any time and just come into the studio, and when we've got other guests as well, if he wants to add something to the conversation, it'd be well appreciated.
And Jim, I'm in the coastal.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut in. I said I'm in the coastal area now, so get me started on a new state, and I'll go door knocking for you.
All right, that's good. Now, are you a member of our Facebook group, the New England State Movement?
I'll check. Maybe not. I'll join up. I'll join up.
Raj was the founder of North Queensland Facebook page.
Founder of
the Yes to a North Queensland Facebook page. He was the founder of that. And thank heavens he's left Cairns and let us get on with it. And give us access to the facility up here.
Jim, he'll be nothing but an asset if he's now located down in your vicinity, and he's very knowledgeable and good at getting the word out. That's for sure.
That sounds good.
Just to be clear, I think if anybody was going to become the seventh state, it's going to be us first. I'm sorry, guys.
Oh, yes. No. Former Q. All right.
Well, good evening. I guess that'll sum up the night, gentlemen. Thank you very much again, Jim and Bill and Raj, for dropping in a little bit later than when we started, but thank you very much. And thank you for sharing your great wealth and knowledge when it comes to the history of the creation of new states, especially the New England movement, and good luck with their campaigning down there in northern New South Wales.
All right. Thank you very much.
No worries. Okay, good evening, gentlemen.
And just one more thing. We're changing the podcast to Wednesday nights.
Just to be able to move it around so it's more convenient for people like myself and Bill and other people that we can get to tune in. Yes, it's most likely going to be 7 or 8 o'clock on Wednesdays. We haven't yet confirmed what the best time may be, but it's most likely moving to Wednesday nights if anybody is listening Friday or onwards. So we'll advertise that correctly on the Facebook pages that are relevant. And, yeah.
Good night.
All right, good night. Thank you again, Jim. Thank you, Jim. Great meeting you and great talking. See you, Raj. See you, Bill. And we'll talk soon.
Good night.
Cheers.